They also announced they're very low on ammunition. When I came in, they announced we had no ammunition. And I said, number one, who's the stupid person saying that? You could tell me, tell a couple of people, but who's the person that wants to say the United States has no ammunition? We're giving it to all of our people all over the world, in particular Ukraine. We're giving them massive, billions of dollars of stuff. And I rebuilt our military, all in 4 years. I have great people. I had great people doing this. And I restocked our ammunition. We had so much ammunition, it was coming out the gills, as they say. We had missiles, now we don't have ammunition. How would you like to be President Xi sitting there saying America has no ammunition? We're so vulnerable. It's not a tax on the middle class, it's a tax on another country. If you look at McKinley, who was actually a great president, he made the country rich. It's probably the richest we ever were, relatively. But he taxed countries for coming in and taking our jobs, for bringing us their product, for taking away our factories because they would make it and come in. And he taxed them. It was called a tariff. And it's not a tax on people. You know, we have the enemy outside, which would be the very standard countries. And we have the enemy from within. We have some very sick people from within. I think that the people that go around indicting their political opponent, especially when their political opponent didn't want to do it to them, I could have done it so easy.
Figure this out. The American people, I think a lot of them want to know, how do you come by your decisions and how do you manage in the Oval Office?
Well, I think that I learned, like I talked about the truckers, I learned about trucks, and by talking to them, in 5 minutes, I knew as much as I'm going to have to know to make decisions that are going to be earth-shattering for transportation, for moving cargo and moving a lot of other things. I learned from having interaction. Some politicians don't have interaction. Some politicians aren't smart. They can't have interactions. I think you have now, this is the United States. When it came to Hillary, you remember, they subpoenaed her stuff and she bleach pit, that's where you just, it's basically acid with them because they're, you know, they're Trump haters at the highest level, and CNN is a Trump hater. Basically, they're liberals. I don't like to use the word progressive. It's too pretty a word. It's such a pretty word. They're progressive. Progressive means you think into the future. They're actually thinking to 3,000 years ago. These people, they're not progressive, but they're liberal. Things are happening that are so crazy. I think there's no human being that was ever treated worse in Congress than Justice Kavanaugh.
And Harris led the battle.
That's right. Oh, she was vicious. Oh, she was the most vicious. She was going after them, just like with Mike Pence, where she said, "You're interrupting me. I want to talk." And that's why, look, ABC is probably the worst in terms of fairness. George Flopadopoulos, the people they have there are just terrible. Jonathan Karl. But that's the only one she'll go to. Now, the other one is the head of ABC is her best friend and her husband's best friend, too. I had to make a decision. Do I want to do this? Do I want to put the wife of the President of the United States and Secretary of State, by the way, do I want to put her in prison? And I'm trying to unify a country that really was broken badly. If you look at, you know, what was going on with Obama when I took this over, this country was had tremendous hatred, anxiety, a lot of hatred. And do I want to put the wife of a president of the United States in prison? I didn't want to do that. And then when I get out, it's like, it's amazing, actually. It's amazing. And it's such a bad precedent because people are going to think about it differently. They're going to think about it differently, and it's very sad, actually. But no, I think you think, like, if you believed in God, you believe in God more. And somebody said, like, why? And I'd like to think that God thinks that I'm going to straighten out our country. Our country is so sick, and it's so broken. Our country is just broken. And maybe that was the reason. I don't know. I don't know.
Did you
a lot of people have, and Luckily, he was taken out quickly. But I'll tell you, if he wasn't, it would have been like in Las Vegas, that horrible attack in Las Vegas with the crazy man up in the building shooting down into the crowds. And that's what you would have had here. These crowds were bigger.
You've been a man of faith. You go to church. You believe in God. Has this further your belief, your commitment, and obviously God, in addition to that chart, saved your life. He has a purpose for you. Do you think about these things?
Well, I think you believe more because when you speak to experts, like my sons who are shooting experts, but when you speak to experts, they said there was no chance that he could have missed from that distance. I think he was hurried. I think he was rushed because people were starting to say, like, you know, there's a guy up there with a gun.
The Kamala Harris campaign is just, despite the fact that people like Fox and others are trying to criticize it, clearly is hitting home runs. The latest poll figures are incredible. Bearing in mind, her campaign is still in its early threshold.
Let's bring in ABC's Jonathan Karl, who'll be hosting This Week later this morning. John, good morning to you. Always great to have you. So we have this new ABC News Ipsos poll out this morning. What do the numbers tell us about the state of the race? And did Vice President Harris get much of a bump after the Democratic convention?
Well, Whit, it shows that this race is very steady. Vice President Harris had a bump after she became the nominee, but the numbers are almost unchanged from before the convention. There you see them, 52% for Harris, 46% for Trump. Now, keep in mind, that is just barely outside the margin of error, Whit. And as you well remember, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the national vote but lost the White House. So that really shows you a race that is very close to statistically tied.
And John, are we seeing any shift in the battleground states?
Same story there in the battleground states. If you look at the 7 states that will really determine who gets elected, you look at there, you see Harris has a slight lead in 6 of the 7 states. But I say slight lead in virtually all of those. This is the 538 polling average. In virtually all of those, it is statistically tied within the margin of error. So again, this race is about as close as it can be, but Democrats are in considerably stronger position than they were when Biden was the nominee.
And so, John, also, what are voters saying about the personal attributes of the candidates and the handling on the big issues?
Well, this really tells the story. If you look in our new poll, you see that Donald Trump has a significant advantage on some of the most important issues for voters. You see immigration and the economy consistently ranking at the top. He has a lead. Harris has eliminated the Republican advantage, at least in our poll, in crime and safety. And, of course, Harris has a big advantage on the issue of abortion. But look at personal attributes. On this, a different story. Harris has a significant advantage over Trump on who people think is physically healthy enough to be president, is honest and trustworthy, understands problems of people like me, and is the mental sharpness to be president. So that tells the story of this essentially statistically tied race. Republicans, Donald Trump has...
And where it really matters, in the marginals and in the swing states, just take Michigan. This is why you see so much nonsense, by the way, which is being shared and spread by Trump and co. Because they're on a slippery pole. They really are. And if they think that some of the crap Don Shitsy Pants and J.D. Vance have been coming out with just in the last few days is going to put the swingometer the other way, I can't see it.
One of the things that jumped out to me in that USA Today poll is that Harris is leading low-income voters 58 to 35%. You've been out there on the trail, you've been talking to people. What stuck out to you either about that poll or kind of what you're seeing out there right now coming into Labor Day and the path ahead?
So what we found really interesting was right before the convention, she was at 60%. Independents were at 7%, and Trump was at 29%. So she is taking away not just from the independents, but she's taking from Trump. And that was before the bump. And this was a poll that Voto Latino conducted with 2,000 voters in battleground states, in Georgia, in North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada. What we're seeing since then is even more appetite for her because she's talking to them in a way that makes sense. This, we haven't covered it enough, but the fact that she's giving them a platform and saying, we're going to build more affordable housing, we're going to talk about rent controls all the way down the line, that is what we have found that young voters, Black and Latino, 18 to 29, housing is their #1 issue. Normally, you think that housing is something that you struggle in your 30s and your 40s, but the fact that she's hitting them exactly where they are speaks to not only who she is, right? Like this idea that she is a woman of color, that she has an immigrant experience, that she can talk to them in code, but then she's also translating it and meeting them where they are with their bread and butter issues that's impacting them.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point because we've long talked about this presidential race not being about policy issues between Harris and Trump.
Right.
But there are some issues. I mean, she was talking about rural health care on this bus tour. You're talking about economic issues that a lot of Latino voters are responding to. How do you explain this kind of big swing among Latino voters in this poll?
So what we found, again, when Biden was on top of the ticket, was not that the people were defecting to the Republican Party, but more that they were interested in third party. And it was women, Latino women, that were defecting to third party because they were aligned with the Democratic issues, but they just felt that they needed something fresh. And that Biden, while great policy, they didn't know his policy. What we found most interesting, and this is why her defining herself on this first interview last night was so important, was that people loved her, but they don't know who she is. So she's a blank slate. That's the best thing for an opportunity for her because unlike Hillary, who had 30 years of baggage because the right defined her, she has an opportunity now to say, this is what I stand for. And we haven't talked about it enough, but it also makes it harder for the far right and for foreign agents to define her on TikTok and on social media platforms because she's speaking to them directly.
In a lot of these answers, what you didn't see is what you do prep candidates for, Jen, in these interviews, which is you answer that and then you pivot to why your opponent's terrible, right? And she didn't do as much of that. And I think maybe that was strategic. It was the first interview. She was focused on her own record and introducing herself to people. And I think that ahead of the debate is the big question, right? And, like for one example of that, in that clip, right before you played it, Dana said, you've never even met Trump before. The debate will be the first time. It might have been interesting to remind Dana why they've never met before.
Right.
It was because Donald Trump didn't show up to the peaceful transition of power because he was pouting like a child and flying home to his house at Mar-a-Lago and his emotional support cougars. And he didn't actually show up. He was the first president in history not to show up to the transition of power. And that was after he tried a violent coup on the Capitol. So that's why they've never met. So she doesn't have to be a pundit like me, but just as an example, I think that there's a lot of material to work with on Trump. And going into the debate, you got to refine answering your question and then pivoting to, but what about this guy?